Before we drift into the shadows of history, don't forget to whisper your support to At Nightfall Notions. Subscribe, and let these tales of the past lull you into curious dreams. Now, let us step into the dim candlelight of the Middle Ages, where beauty was not merely a matter of admiration, but a dangerous game of power, piety, and peril. Chapter 1. The Curse of Beauty. An Introduction. In the year 1347, in a village whose name has long been swallowed by time, there lived a girl named Alice. She was not just pretty, she was the kind of pretty that made priests sigh into their prayer books and mothers clutch their daughters closer at market. Her hair was the color of wheat, kissed by the last light of evening, her skin like cream left to thicken in the cool air of a dairy house. But Alice's beauty was not a blessing. It was a curse, or so the villagers murmured when they thought she couldn't hear. To be fair, the Middle Ages were not kind to beauty, at least not in the way one might expect. A lovely face could win you a wealthy marriage, yes, but it could also mark you as a witch, a temptress, or worse, a target. The church preached that excessive beauty was a distraction, a snare for the weak-willed, a vanity that led souls astray. A woman too fair might be accused of consorting with the devil, for how else could she command such unnatural allure? And so Alice, with her devastating cheekbones and eyes like polished river stones, found herself walking a tightrope between admiration and suspicion. Her mother, a practical woman with hands roughened by years of scrubbing linen, tried to dull her daughter's radiance with loose-fitting gowns and smudges of soot on her cheeks. But beauty, like mold or gossip, has a way of spreading despite all efforts to contain it. When Alice turned 15, the local lord's son took one look at her and decided he must have her. Not as a wife, God forbid, but as a dalliance, a trinket to boast about in taverns. His father, a man who believed women were either saints or sinners with no ground in between, declared Alice a corrupting influence and ordered her to veil herself like a widow. The irony, of course, was that Alice had no interest in corruption. She liked tending goats and listening to the old miller stories, and she harbored a secret love for the smell of ink, though she couldn't read a word of it. But in a world where a woman's worth was measured by her piety or her dowry, her beauty became a thing she carried like a burden, a sack of gold she could neither spend nor discard. Hallelujah. Then came the whispers. The baker's wife claimed Alice had bewitched her yeast, for why else would her loaves refuse to rise? A traveling friar, catching sight of her in the square, crossed himself and muttered about Eve's daughters. Even the village children, who once trailed after her like ducklings, began to shy away, their parents warning them that beauty like hers was a sign, though no one could agree on what exactly it signified. And so Alice learned the first rule of being too pretty in the Middle Ages. Your face was never truly your own. It was a mirror for others' desires, their fears, their guilt. It was a canvas onto which they painted their own stories, of sin, of danger, of divine punishment. And worst of all, it was a thing that could, at any moment, turn from an asset into a noose. But this is only the beginning of her tale. For Alice's story, like so many others lost to time, is not just about beauty's curse. It's about what happens when a woman refuses to let that curse define her. And that, dear listener, is a story worth staying awake for. Chapter 2. Divine Favor or Devil's Mark? Alice had never understood why people spoke of beauty as if it were a choice. No one praised a rose for being red or scolded a storm cloud for being gray. Yet her face was treated as something she had cultivated, as if she had whispered to the angels at birth and demanded unfair advantages. The village priest, Father Martel, was particularly fond of lecturing on the matter, his sermons dripping with warnings about vanity and the snares of the flesh. One Sunday, as Alice knelt in the drafty chapel, trying to ignore the prickling stares of the congregation, Father Martel's voice thundered from the pulpit. "Beware the comely face," he intoned, "for the devil clothes his temptations in fair wrappings. A woman's beauty is a test of her humility and of men's virtue. Alais kept her eyes on the uneven stones of the floor, but she could feel the weight of every gaze shifting toward her, as if she were the living embodiment of the sermon. It was an old argument, one that had been debated in monasteries and market squares for centuries. Was beauty a gift from God, a glimpse of divine harmony in a fallen world? Or was it a trick, a distraction from piety, a lure into sin? The Church, ever suspicious of anything that stirred the senses, tended toward the latter. Saints were supposed to be plain, their faces worn with fasting and prayer, their bodies unremarkable vessels for the Spirit. The Virgin Mary, in most depictions, was serene but modest, her beauty ethereal rather than earthly. A woman who drew too much attention with her appearance was by default suspect. This was why, when the village's milk cow suddenly went dry, it was Alais who was blamed. Old Nanette, who claimed to have the second sight, declared that the animal had been cursed by the evil eye. "And who?" she croaked, her gnarled finger pointing like a rusted scythe, "has eyes brighter than the devil's own lanterns?" The accusation hung in the air, thick as the smell of dung and damp wool. No one outright called Alais a witch, not yet, but the suspicion was there, a shadow stretching longer with each passing day. Alais' only ally, if she could call him that, was Brother Anselm, a rotund Franciscan friar who passed through the village twice a year. Unlike the dour Father Martel, Brother Anselm had a laugh like a creaking cartwheel and a fondness for honey cakes. He also had a peculiar view of beauty. "God made the world, didn't he once said to Alais, wiping crumbs from his beard. "And he called it good. So why shouldn't a pretty face be part of that goodness?" It was a comforting thought, but one that held little sway in a world where fear was sharper than reason. Still, the question lingered in Alais' mind. If beauty was a sin, why did the stained glass windows in the cathedral glow with such rich colors? Why did the priests wear robes of fine wool and gold thread? Why were the faces of saints gilded and adored, while hers was treated like a crime? The answer, she supposed, was that beauty was only holy when it was locked away behind altar screens or framed in stained glass. When it walked among ordinary people, when it belonged to a girl who mended socks and fed chickens, it became dangerous. The irony was not lost on her. The same church that warned against vanity built its grandest cathedrals to dazzle the eye. The same men who preached modesty whispered about her in the confessional. And the same villagers who crossed themselves at the sight of her would, in secret, press coins into her palm for a lock of her hair. A charm, they said, for love or luck. Alais kept the coins but burned the requests. She was no saint, but she refused to be a relic either. Yet the whispers grew louder. When a fever swept through the village, sparing only a handful of households, someone noticed that Alais had not fallen ill. When the Lord's prized hound refused to bark at her, someone else recalled that dogs were said to sense evil. And when a traveling painter offered to sketch her likeness, for art, he insisted, nothing more, the village decided it had tolerated her presence long enough. The truth was, medieval society had no tidy answer for beauty. It was both divine favor and devil's mark, depending on who needed an excuse for their envy or desire. And Alais, caught in the middle, was running out of places to hide. But if they thought she would simply bow her head and disappear, they had misjudged her. After all, the devil wasn't the only one who knew how to use a pretty face. Chapter 3. The Trials of Fair Maidens. Alais had always known that marriage was inevitable. In a world where a woman's value was measured in land, livestock, and the ability to bear sons, beauty was simply another bargaining chip, assuming, of course, that it hadn't already been declared the devil's currency. Her mother had made that clear years ago, when Alais was still small enough to hide behind her skirts. "You'll marry whoever your father chooses," she had said, kneading dough with hands that had never known idleness, "and you'll thank God for him, even if he's got the face of a startled hog." But now, at 17, Alais found herself in a peculiar predicament. The local Lord Steward had come calling, not to negotiate a dowry, but to inform her father, in tones so syrupy they near curdled the air, that the young lord himself had taken an interest. "Not as a wife, mind you," the steward had added, as if this were a kindness. "But a man of his standing has certain needs, and your daughter, well, she's unlikely to find a decent match otherwise." The insult was so neatly wrapped in false benevolence that Alea's father hadn't even bristled. He'd simply nodded, as though offered a fair price for a slightly bruised apple. This was the first trial of fair maidens. Beauty might catch a man's eye, but it rarely secured his respect. A village girl like Alea could hope for a farmer's son, perhaps a tradesman if she were fortunate. But noblemen did not marry peasants, no matter how lovely. They took mistresses, bastards, and secrets to the grave. Alea had other ideas. She waited until nightfall, then slipped into the woods with a bundle of herbs, pilfered from the cunning woman's garden. There was an art to making oneself plain, not with soot or rags, but with the right mixture of tansy and rue, boiled into a tonic that would bring on a rash just fierce enough to dissuade lustful gazes. The cunning woman had warned her it would itch like the devil's own beard, but Alea reckoned that was a fair trade. The next morning, when the young lord came to inspect his would-be conquest, he found her red-faced and peeling, scratching furiously at her arms. "God's teeth," he muttered, recoiling as if she'd sprouted quills. By noon, the betrothal, if one could call it that, was off. Her relief lasted exactly 3 days. That was when the miller's wife, a woman with a tongue sharp enough to fillet fish, announced that only witchcraft could explain such a sudden affliction. After all, hadn't Alea been seen gathering herbs under a waning moon? Didn't the Bible warn of women who mixed potions and cast spells? Thus began the second trial of fair maidens, the ease with which beauty could curdle into suspicion. A pretty girl might be accused of vanity, a plain one of sourness. But a girl who dared refuse the advances of her betters, she was clearly in league with darker forces. The village reeve, a man who fancied himself both pious and pragmatic, proposed a test. Alea would be made to walk barefoot across the hot coals of the blacksmith's forge. If she were innocent, God would protect her. If not, well, the smell of burning flesh would be proof enough. Alea, who had no intention of being anyone's theological barbecue, played her last card. She burst into tears, not the delicate, maidenly kind, but great, heaving sobs that made her nose run and her face blotch. "I'm not a witch," she wailed. "I'm just ugly now." It was the perfect defense. No one could believe a witch would be so inelegant. The reeve, embarrassed by the spectacle, called off the trial. The villagers, ever fickle, shifted their whispers back to pity. Poor Alea, struck down by some humbling malady. How fortunate, they murmured, that the Lord's son had been spared. But Alea knew the truth. She had won this battle, but the war was far from over. For the third trial of fair maidens was the cruelest of all. The realization that no matter what she did, her fate would always be decided by others. Unless, of course, she decided to change the rules. And that, as it turned out, was exactly what she intended to do. Chapter 4. Handsome Knights and Their Woes. While Alea schemed her way out of marriage and witch trials, a rather different sort of beauty-related crisis was unfolding 3 villages over, in the draughty stone keep of Sir Guy de Montferrat. Sir Guy was, by any measure, obscenely handsome. His jawline could have sharpened knives. His eyes were the precise shade of blue that made troubadours weep into their goblets. And his hair, God's teeth, his hair, fell in golden waves that would have put the Virgin's gilded halo to shame. This, as it turned out, was a problem. Chivalry, that noble code of honor and courtly love, had a peculiar blind spot when it came to men like Guy. A knight was meant to be brave, pious, and strong, but nowhere did the rules mention what to do when the local baron's wife kept sighing dramatically during feasts, or when rival knights accused you of winning tournaments through seduction rather than skill. Take, for instance, the incident at the Michaelmas tournament. Guy had unhorsed 4 opponents in a row, a feat that should have earned him cheers, a fat purse, and perhaps a modest increase in landholdings. Instead, the crowd buzzed with whispers that Countess Isabeau had bet an indecent sum on him, and that her husband's face had turned the color of overcooked beetroot. The tournament marshal, a grizzled veteran who'd lost an eye to a Saracen arrow, declared Guy the winner through gritted teeth, then muttered, just loud enough to be heard, that it was a shame the boy hadn't been born ugly. "It's not my fault," Guy grumbled later to his long-suffering squire, a pimpled youth named Thibault. "I train 6 hours a day. I pray. I tithe. Why does no one mention that?" Thibault, who had spent the last year polishing Guy's armor and fielding love letters from noble women, and, on one memorable occasion, a nobleman, wisely said nothing. The truth was, handsome knights faced a peculiar paradox. Their looks opened doors, quite literally, in the case of certain enthusiastic widows, but those same doors often led to accusations of vanity, favoritism, or worse. A homely knight could be praised for his devotion to duty. A comely one was assumed to be shirking it. When Guy donated 1/10 of his income to the local monastery, the abbot thanked him with a lecture on the perils of pride. When he refused the advances of the duke's daughter, she spread rumors that he preferred the company of sheep. This was especially unfair, as Guy had never so much as glanced at a sheep, though the same could not be said for the duke's daughter. Even the church, which ought to have been above such things, was not immune. Father Reynard, the diocese's most zealous preacher, had recently delivered a sermon on the sin of manly adornment, citing Sir Guy's habit of wearing clean tunics as evidence of moral decay. "A knight should reek of sweat and righteousness," the priest thundered, conveniently ignoring the fact that most of his congregation reeked only of sweat. But the final indignity came when Guy was summoned to settle a land dispute between 2 farmers. He listened carefully, weighed the evidence, and ruled in favor of the older man, whose claim was clearly valid. The younger farmer, thwarted, spat at Guy's boots and snarled, "Course you'd take his side. Bet he's got a pretty daughter, hasn't he?" Guy, who hadn't even known the man had a daughter, briefly considered throwing himself into the moat. Back in his village, Allais heard fragments of these tales. The knight too handsome for his own good, the countess' tantrums, the sheep-related slander. At first, she dismissed them as the usual nonsense whispered at the well. But then a thought struck her. What if Sir Guy's predicament was not so different from her own? Both were trapped by the expectations tied to their faces. Both faced accusations they hadn't earned. And both, perhaps, could benefit from a bit of strategic ugliness. So when a traveling minstrel brought news that Sir Guy would be passing through their village on his way to another doomed tournament, Allais made a decision. She would meet this famously beautiful knight, not to flirt, not to sigh, but to propose an alliance. After all, if the world insisted on judging them by their looks, why not use those looks to play the game better than anyone else? Chapter 5. The Beauty Tax. A heavy burden. The morning Sir Guy de Montferrat rode into Allais' village, the market square erupted into the usual circus of whispers and dropped baskets. Peasant women nudged each other behind flour-dusted sleeves, while their husbands scowled and pretended not to notice the way their wives' gazes lingered. Even the village geese, normally indifferent to human vanity, seemed to pause mid-honk to admire the gleam of his spurs. Allais watched from the shadow of the baker's oven, arms crossed. She had expected the knight to be handsome. Stories of his golden looks had reached even their backwater hamlet. But she hadn't anticipated the sheer inconvenience of his presence. Already, the reeve was bowing so low his nose nearly scraped the mud, offering the finest ale, which in this village meant the least weevil-infested. A gaggle of girls had abandoned their spinning to cluster near the well, giggling in a way that suggested they'd forgotten how lungs normally function. Guy, to his credit, looked miserable. "God's bones," he muttered to his squire as he dismounted. "If one more person sighs at me, I'm joining a hermitage." Thibault, juggling saddlebags and a wilting bouquet some bold farmer's daughter had thrust into his arms, snorted. "You'd have to grow a beard first. and stop standing like someone's painted you on a chapel wall. Allez seizte a moment. She stepped forward, deliberately scuffing her shoes in the muck, no small feat given the state of the road, and planted herself directly in Guy's path. "They say you fined a man last week for stealing a pig," she said, loud enough to cut through the murmurs. "Is it true you took his daughter as payment?" The square went silent. Guy blinked. The accusation was absurd. He'd sentenced the pig thief to a week repairing fences, and the man didn't have a daughter. But before he could protest, Allez barreled on. "Or is that just the beauty tax?" Her voice carried sharp as a scythe. "A few extra coins if you're pretty. A daughter if you're prettier. And if you're G2 pretty." She let the sentence hang, heavy as an executioner's axe. The villagers shifted uncomfortably. They knew the rules. A comely face might catch a rich husband, but it also drew the eye of tax collectors, bailiffs, and lords looking to pad their coffers with gifts from grateful fathers. Last winter, the miller's blonde daughter had been hauled off to the castle for tutelage in weaving. She'd returned 3 months later with a silver bracelet and a hollow stare. No one spoke of it. Guy's jaw tightened. He'd heard of such things, of course, had even intervened once when a sheriff tried to demand a merchant's sister as collateral for a debt. But seeing the flicker of recognition in Allez's eyes, the way the villagers refused to meet his gaze, made his stomach turn. "There is no tax," he said too stiffly. The lie tasted like rust. Allez arched a brow. "Then why does my father owe 5 extra bushels this harvest? The Revis says it's for my protection." She spat the word like rotten fruit. Funny how ugly girls never need protecting. A mutter rippled through the crowd. Old Nanette crossed herself. The Reeve turned an interesting shade of puce. Guy opened his mouth. To apologize? To promise justice? But Allez was already walking away, her skirt swishing through the mud with deliberate vulgarity. She'd made her point. That evening, as Guy dined in the Reeve smoke-blackened hall, on stew that was mostly onion, served by a girl who nearly tripped twice while staring at him, he couldn't shake the encounter. "This beauty tax," he said abruptly, breaking a silence that had stretched too long. "Is it common?" The Reeve choked on his ale. "My lord, I'm sure I don't." "The truth." The Reeve hesitated, then sighed. "It's not say called a tax, but yes, a pretty daughter can mean lower rents if the lord's in a mood, or higher ones if he thinks you're hiding her." He shrugged as if discussing the weather. "The church takes its share too, special tithes for vanity, though they only seem to notice vanity on poor girls." Guy set down his spoon, appetite gone. He thought of his own mother, a baron's daughter praised for her looks until the day she dared to age. Of the duke's son who'd bragged about collecting peasant brides like trinkets. Of Allez, standing in the mud with defiance in her eyes and a village's worth of unfairness on her shoulders. Meanwhile, in a cramped cottage at the edge of the village, Allez was explaining her plan to her bewildered parents. "Well, say I'm betrothed," she said, stirring a pot of gluey porridge. "To someone far away, someone with ancient power." Her father, a man of few words, grunted. "Like who? The king?" "Better." Allez smiled. "A knight who hates his own face as much as I hate mine." Because that was the heart of it, wasn't it? Beauty wasn't currency. It was a debt, one that kept compounding with interest until it buried you. Unless, of course, you found a way to make the system choke on its own hypocrisy. And Allez had just the man in mind. Chapter 6. Fashion Faux Pas and Floggings. 3 days after Sir Guy's arrival, the village crier announced a new decree from the local bishop. Henceforth, any woman under the age of 50 caught wearing ribbons, lace, or any garment dyed a color brighter than repentant mud would be fined 3 pence or subjected to the humiliation of the Jeech Ejamais, the hack-like shift reserved for those The proclamation was met with groans from the young women, and knowing smirks from the old ones who had long since aged out of such persecution. Ale, stirring a vat of lye soap over the fire, nearly snapped her wooden spoon in half. "Ribbons," she seethed. "Half these women can't afford bread, let alone silk trimmings. Who does the bishop think he's fooling?" Her mother, stitching a tear in their only good blanket, didn't look up. "Same as always. It's not about the lace, it's about reminding us where we stand." She wasn't wrong. Medieval sumptuary laws, those delightfully petty regulations dictating who could wear what, were a minefield of hypocrisy. Nobles draped themselves in ermine and samite, while passing laws forbidding peasants from wearing wool that was too soft or colors too vibrant. The church, meanwhile, railed against vanity while commissioning golden vestments heavy enough to cripple a donkey. But the real kicker, as Ale soon learned, was that men faced their own absurd restrictions. When Sir Guy appeared at the village well that afternoon, he was sporting a spectacular black eye and a distinctly unknightly scowl. "What happened to Ishika?" Ale asked, pretending not to notice how the bruise made his stupidly perfect bone structure even more striking. Guy sighed. "The Duke's tailor." As it turned out, Guy's crime had been wearing a new surcoat embroidered with silver thread, a gift from a grateful merchant whose daughter had saved from an overly enthusiastic suitor. Unfortunately, the Duke's own son had recently been reprimanded for wearing nearly identical embroidery, and no one was permitted to outshine the ducal heir. The tailor, caught between a furious prince and a bewildered knight, had solved the problem by reporting Guy for immodest display. The punishment? A fistfight behind the buttery, which Guy had technically won but politically lost. "So now I'm banned from wearing anything but undyed linen for a month," Guy grumbled. "As if I need more reasons for people to stare." Ale snorted. "Try being fine for having cheekbones." They stood in companionable silence for a moment, united in mutual irritation. Then Ale had an idea. A terrible, dangerous, possibly brilliant idea. "What if," she said slowly, "we gave them exactly what they want?" Guy frowned. "A written apology to the Duke's tailor? No, a spectacle." Because here was the truth about sumptuary laws. They weren't really about modesty. They were about control. And nothing undermined control like taking the rules to their ludicrous extreme. The next morning, the village awoke to a sight that would be gossiped about for decades. Ale, clad in a dress so aggressively drab it made burlap look festive, was leading a procession of women to Sunday Mass. Each wore identical shapeless sacks, their hair hidden under scarves tied so tightly they could barely blink. At the rear, Sir Guy and his squire brought up the rear in plain tunics, their belts cinched with rope instead of leather, their boots scuffed beyond recognition. Father Martel, emerging from the church, nearly dropped his psalter. "What in God's name?" "We've come to repent," Ale announced, her voice dripping with false piety, "for the sin of being born with faces." She gestured to Guy. "The knight, too. His cheekbones are practically a mortal sin." The villagers, many of whom had spent years resenting the priest's nitpicking about hemlines and hatpins, began to snicker. For his part, Guy played his role to perfection. He knelt in the dirt with exaggerated humility. "I repent my teeth, Father. They're disturbingly straight." Even Father Martel couldn't maintain his outrage in the face of such absurdity. By week's end, the new clothing laws were being enforced with markedly less enthusiasm. The bishop, when informed of the incident, decided it was better to quietly drop the matter than risk further mockery. And Ale? She allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. Because the real secret of fashion laws, like all unjust rules, was that they crumbled the moment people stopped taking them seriously. Though she did keep the sack dress, one never knew when an on-performance might be required. Chapter 7. The Ugly Truth About Beauty Standards. By the time Brother Anselm returned to the village with his donkey cart full of questionable relics and excellent honey cakes, Alais had developed a theory. Medieval beauty standards, she decided, were like the weather, unpredictable, prone to sudden shifts, and likely to leave you drenched in regret no matter how you prepared. The Rotend friar proved an excellent source of confirmation. Over a shared loaf of bread, slightly stale, but beggars couldn't be choosers, he regaled her with tales of beauty's fickle nature across Christendom. In Florence, he said, brushing crumbs from his habit, women pluck their hairlines back to make their foreheads look like peeled eggs. In Paris, they want tiny rosebud mouths, so ladies suck on lemons before court appearances. God help us. God help. Alais tried to imagine walking while hobbled by decorative footwear and nearly snorted ale through her nose. So what you're saying is, everyone's mad. Not mad, Anselm corrected cheerfully. Just desperate. Beauty's a moving target, girl. Today's comely as tomorrow's crone. He leaned in, lowering his voice. Take Queen Eleanor. When she was young, they praised her lush figure. Now that she's older, the same poets call her sturdy as a draft horse. This explained a great deal. Alais had noticed how the village's idea of beauty shifted with the seasons. Last year, when a pox left half the population pockmarked, smooth skin became unfashionable overnight. The baker's daughter, once mocked for her freckles, suddenly found herself drowning in marriage offers. Until the next harvest, when a traveling minstrel's song about starry-eyed maidens made freckles passé again. Sir Guy, who had joined them midway through the conversation, looked pained. That explains why my aunt insists I grow a beard. Last month beards were heathenish, now they're dignified. Ah, but you mustn't grow it too thick, Anselm warned. A sparse beard denotes wisdom. A full one suggests you're hiding secrets, or a weak chin. Guy groaned. The contradictions didn't stop at facial hair. Noblewomen blanched their skin with lead powder to appear delicate, while peasant women were scorned for looking too pale, lazy, the Reeve called it. Curves were either childbearing hips or gluttonous indulgence, depending on which priest you asked. Even height was a gamble. Tall men were commanding until someone decided they were looming, while petite women flipped between elfin and sickly with alarming frequency. Alais, who had spent years being told her looks were either a blessing or a curse, but never simply hers, felt a familiar frustration simmering. So who decides? Anselm shrugged. Whoever's winning at the moment. Kings, bishops, poets with rich patrons. Sometimes just the loudest fool in the room. He patted his stomach fondly. Take me. In my youth, a belly like this meant prosperity. Now the French courtiers starve themselves to look like half-plucked chickens. Fashion's a fickle god. This revelation sparked something in Alais. If beauty standards could change on a nobleman's whim, why not use that absurdity? She waited until market day, when the village square was packed with gossips and hawkers, then staged her boldest performance yet. With Guy playing the baffled straight man, I don't understand. Why am I holding this turnip? She announced to the gathered crowd that she'd received divine guidance about the new standard of beauty. The angels say freckles are back in fashion, she proclaimed, gesturing to her own sun-kissed nose. But only if they're arranged in constellations. Mine form the Big Dipper, see? The villagers craned their necks, half convinced. And crooked teeth are now a sign of humility, she continued, bearing hers proudly. Straight ones suggest vanity. Sir Guy here is practically a heretic. Guy, to his credit, played along, clutching his turnip like a scepter. I repent my symmetrical face. By week's end, the village was in chaos. Women who'd spent years hiding their freckles with buttermilk now dotted them with charcoal to enhance the heavenly patterns. The blacksmith's gap-toothed daughter, once deemed unmarriageable, received 3 proposals. Even Father Martel found himself stroking his newly fashionable paunch with unseemly pride. The bishop, when word reached him, nearly choked on his eel pie. This is blasphemy. But it was too late. The genie of subjectivity was out of the bottle. For the first time, peasants were questioning why they'd ever let the powerful define beauty in the first place. As for Alais, she allowed herself a quiet victory. Let the nobles keep their lead powder and golden chains. She had something far more powerful. The knowledge that beauty wasn't a law of nature. It was a story. And stories, as any fool knew, could be rewritten. Chapter 8. Scandalous Stories of Medieval Models. Brother Anselm's donkey cart carried more than dubious relics and honey cakes. It bore gossip from every corner of Christendom, each tale more outrageous than the last. And so, as Alais and Sir Guy sat by the fire in the village inn, the good friar regaled them with stories of beauties who had learned the hard way that a pretty face could be as dangerous as a loaded crossbow. Take the case of Lady Melisande of Provence. Anselm began, warming his hands over the hearth. She was so breathtaking that troubadours composed entire epics about the curve of her little finger. Noblemen jousted in her honor, and one particularly besotted count commissioned a stained-glass window of her likeness for his private chapel. He paused for dramatic effect. Then his wife found out. The resulting scandal involved a smashed window, a public duel fought with loaves of bread. The Countess had surprisingly good aim, and Melisande being packed off to a nunnery so remote even the mice were celibate. Last I heard, Anselm mused, she'd taken up illustrating manuscripts, mostly unflattering portraits of the Countess. The eye shook his head. I once knew a knight who wrote poetry about a merchant's daughter. She married a wool trader and moved to Ghent. The knight took it rather well, only set fire to 3 haystacks in despair. But not all stories ended with mere exile or singed hay. Anselm's voice dropped as he recounted the fate of Isabella of Navarre, a woman whose golden tresses had inspired comparisons to the Virgin Mary, until a rival noble spread rumors that her hair was a gift from the devil himself. They say she washed it in holy water to prove otherwise, Anselm said. But when it shone brighter, well, the friar made a gesture that suggested flames. Alais felt a chill that had nothing to do with the drafty inn. So beauty is a crime if someone decides it is. Only if you're not the one making the rules, Anselm replied cheerfully. Queen Eleanor's grandfather famously kept a mistress so stunning he had her portrait painted on his shield. When the Pope protested, the king declared her a symbol of divine grace and charged onward. Literally. The conversation took a darker turn when a traveling minstrel, drawn by the scent of spiced wine, offered his own contribution. There was a girl in Toulouse, he said, tuning his lute with practiced nonchalance, whose lips were so red people swore she'd made a pact with the devil. The local baron, a pious man, or so he claimed, demanded she prove her innocence by kissing a leper. Guy's goblet hit the table with a thud. That's monstrous. The minstrel shrugged. She married the leper instead. Turns out he was a disinherited viscount with excellent landholdings. Last I heard, they were hosting lavish feasts and serving wine so fine it made bishops weep. He plucked a jaunty chord. So you see, every curse can be a blessing if you're clever enough. Alais mulled this over as the fire crackled. History was full of women who'd been punished for their beauty, or worse, had it weaponized against them. But it was also full of those who'd turned their looks to their advantage, who'd wielded charm like a dagger and walked away with crowns instead of curses. She glanced at Guy, who was currently fending off the innkeeper's daughter with polite but firm disinterest. Then she looked at Anselm, whose girth and jovial demeanor made him everyone's favorite confessor. And finally at the minstrel, whose plain face was offset by a voice that could melt stone. Perhaps the trick wasn't to resent beauty's power, and to ensure no one else could use it against you. The next morning, Alais set her plan in motion. If the world insisted on judging her by her face, she'd give them a spectacle they'd never forget. With Guy's reluctant help and Anselm's enthusiastic blessing, she staged a miracle in the village square. As the crowd gathered, Alais, dressed in a deliberately ragged gown, announced that the Virgin had appeared to her in a dream, declaring that true beauty was found in kindness, not cheekbones. Then she produced a loaf of bread, baked by her mother, and miraculously divided it among the village's poorest children. The effect was instant. By sundown, the Reeve had reduced her family's taxes in honor of her piety. The baker, suddenly inspired, vowed to donate stale loaves to the needy. Even Father Martel, who'd been mid-sermon on the evils of vanity, found himself praising Alais' humility. Guy, watching from the shadows, marveled at the performance. "You've turned holiness into a fashion." Alais grinned. "Why not? If they'll believe a pretty face is sinful, they'll believe it's saintly too." And so the legend of Alais the pious was born, a reputation carefully curated, meticulously maintained, and entirely at odds with the sharp-witted schemer beneath the veil. But that, as they say, was a story for another day. Chapter 9. The Make-up Dilemma. Painted Faces and Punishment. The first time Alais saw a noblewoman up close, she nearly laughed at the absurdity of her face. The lady's cheeks were slathered with a paste of crushed strawberries and egg whites, her lips stained with a mixture of beeswax and crushed beetles that made them gleam like wet rubies. Her eyebrows had been plucked to near non-existence, then redrawn with soot in delicate arches that gave her a permanent look of surprise. She looked, Alais thought, like someone had taken a perfectly good face, and then decided to improve upon God's work with whatever they could scavenge from a kitchen and an apothecary's shop. Yet when the noblewoman passed through the village, the peasants gaped as if she were a vision from heaven. The same women who had once hissed at Alais for the crime of having naturally rosy cheeks now whispered in awe of this painted stranger. It was Brother Anselm who explained the contradiction, his voice thick with amusement as he watched the spectacle from the shade of the churchyard. "The rules are simple," he murmured to Alais. "If you're rich, makeup is sophistication. If you're poor, it's deception. If you're a noblewoman, painting your face is an art. If you're a peasant, it's a sin." Alais had seen evidence of this hypocrisy before. Last winter, the miller's wife had been fined for tinting her lips with elderberry juice, the Reeve declaring that she was tempting honest men into sin. Yet when the Duke's daughter visited the following month, her face powdered so thickly that it cracked when she smiled. The same Reeve had bowed so low his nose nearly brushed the mud. The church's stance was even more baffling. Father Martel regularly thundered against the devil's paints, warning that any woman who dared adorn her face was spitting in the eye of God's creation. Yet the bishop's own sister was rumored to spend hours each morning applying a Venetian ceruse so toxic it had reportedly killed 2 of her handmaids. Sir Guy, who had been listening to this with growing bewilderment, finally spoke up. "So let me understand. A noblewoman can poison herself to look paler, and that's piety. But if a peasant girl pinches her cheeks for color, she's damned?" "Precisely," Anselm said, reaching for another honey cake. "It's not about the paint. It's about who's holding the brush." Alais was beginning to see the pattern. The powerful could do as they pleased, their excesses excused as refinement. The poor, meanwhile, were punished for even the mildest attempts at self-adornment. It was the beauty tax all over again, just with more lead poisoning. This double standard reached its peak when a traveling merchant arrived in the village, his cart laden with cosmetics from the East. There were pots of kohl from Egypt, delicate vials of rosewater from Persia, even a rare powder made from crushed pearls that promised to bestow the luminosity of the moon. The village women gathered around, their eyes wide with longing, but none dared purchase anything, not with the Reeve watching like a hawk, except for Alais. She waited until the merchant was packing up, then approached him under the guise of buying thread. As their hands brushed during the exchange, a small pot of rouge found its way into her sleeve. That night, by the dim light of a tallow candle, Allais experimented. The rouge was richer than anything she'd seen before, a deep crimson that blended seamlessly into her skin. A touch of kohl darkened her lashes, and a hint of pearl powder gave her cheekbones an otherworldly glow. She studied her reflection in a scrap of polished metal, fascinated by the transformation. She didn't look like a different person, just a more polished version of herself. The next morning she washed it all off before leaving the house. Guy caught her at the well, his gaze knowing. "You're planning something." Allais smiled. "I'm planning to give the church exactly what it wants." 2 days later, the village was abuzz with news. Father Martel had announced a public cleansing ceremony where women could come forward and renounce their vanity by surrendering their cosmetics to be burned. The turnout was impressive. Dozens of women arrived with pots of homemade blush, bottles of scented oils, even a few precious combs. Allais arrived last, her face bare. As the fire crackled, she stepped forward and placed a single half-empty pot of rouge into the flames. The crowd gasped. It was the same shade the noblewoman had worn. Father Martel, sensing an opportunity, seized her hand and raised it high. "Behold the purity of true repentance," he boomed. The villagers murmured in awe. Allais the pious had struck again. What they didn't see was the second pot of rouge hidden under her floorboards, or the knowing glance she shared with the merchant's daughter, who would be receiving a discreet order for more coal next week. Because Allais had learned the most important lesson of all. If the world was determined to call her a saint, she might as well enjoy the occasional sin. Chapter 10. The Mirror. A dangerous object. The day the bishop banned mirrors from the village, Allais was in the middle of plucking a chicken. Father Martel had assembled the villagers in the square, his face flushed with righteous fervor as he brandished a small silver-handled mirror like it was a venomous serpent. "Behold the devil's tool," he thundered, turning it to catch the sunlight. "This device of vanity turns women from God's work to sinful admiration of their own faces." Allais watched as a group of boys, egged on by the priest, brought forth a cracked looking-glass from the innkeeper's wife's chambers and smashed it against the cobblestones. The crowd gasped as if witnessing an exorcism. Brother Anselm, leaning against the alehouse door, muttered just loud enough for Allais to hear. "Last month they were smashing stained glass windows for being too colorful. Next they'll ban puddles for showing reflection." The hysteria over mirrors wasn't new, Allais learned. Venetian glassmakers had perfected the art of creating clear mirrors just decades earlier, and now the church was determined to stamp out what they called the Narcissus plague. Wealthy ladies hid their hand mirrors like contraband, while convents banned them outright. A nun caught gazing at her reflection might face weeks of bread-and-water penance. Yet the hypocrisy was staggering. That same afternoon, Allais delivered eggs to the manor house and saw the Lord's new acquisition. An enormous Flemish mirror framed in gilt wood, prominently displayed in the great hall. When she commented on it to a servant, the woman shrugged. "His lordship says it's art. Just don't tell the bishop." Guy found Allais that evening by the creek, staring at her rippling reflection in the water. "Contemplating your heresy?" he asked, tossing a pebble to distort her image. "I was counting my freckles," she lied, making sure none formed any blasphemous constellations. The truth was, Allais had been experimenting. The merchant's daughter had smuggled her a palm-sized mirror last week, wrapped in plain cloth. At first Allais had felt foolish peering at herself. Wasn't that exactly the vanity the priests warned against? But then she'd realized something startling. The mirror didn't make her admire herself. It made her see herself clearly for the first time. Not as a blessing or a curse, not as a saint or a temptation, but just as Allais. Sir Guy sat beside her, the fading light turning the creek to molten copper. "My father had all the mirrors removed from our castle after my mother died," he said suddenly. "Claimed they distracted the servants from their work. Really, he couldn't stand seeing his own grief reflected back at him. Ale considered this. Maybe that was the real fear. Not that mirrors would make people vain, but that they'd show uncomfortable truths. A peasant might see dignity where she was told to see humility. A knight might question his valor. A priest might glimpse his own hypocrisy. The next Sunday, when Father Martel called for the destruction of all reflective surfaces, Ale made a great show of surrendering a piece of polished tin she'd never used. The village wives followed suit, handing over their few precious shards of glass with performative reluctance. The priest built a pyre in the square, declaring this a victory over vanity. What he didn't see was Ales's quick fingers slipping a fragment of mirror into her sleeve before it reached the flames. What he didn't know was that the merchant's daughter now kept 3 looking-glasses hidden in her cart, available for a modest fee. And what none of them realized was that the clearest mirror in the village wasn't made of glass at all. It was Ale herself, reflecting back to the world exactly what it expected to see, while keeping her truest self carefully hidden. As the smoke from the burning mirrors curled toward heaven, Ale caught Guy's eye and smiled. Let the priests smash their looking-glasses. The reflections that mattered couldn't be broken so easily. Chapter 11. Beauty and the Beastly Consequences. The morning the poisoned comb arrived, Ale was in the middle of scrubbing laundry by the river. The parcel, wrapped in fine linen and tied with silk thread, had been delivered by a nervous-looking page who refused to say who sent it, only that it was a gift for the fairest maiden in the village. Ale turned the comb over in her hands. The teeth were carved from bone, the handle inlaid with what looked like amber. It was the sort of trinket that might have made another girl's heart flutter. Hers merely sank. Brother Anselm, who had been dozing under the willow tree, cracked one eye opened. "Ah," he said, without needing to look properly. "The classic poison gift gambit. Let me guess, anonymous admirer?" Ale held the comb away from her body like it might bite. "Do you think it's really laced with belladonna, dipped in arsenic, or just cursed by a disgruntled witch?" Anselm stretched lazily. "Hard to say. The nobility do love their dramatic flourishes. This wasn't paranoia. Last summer, a countess had sent her rival a pair of gloves lined with wolfsbane. The winter before, a jealous knight had gifted his lady love an apple stuffed with ground-glass. And according to Anselm's increasingly alarming stories, this was tame compared to the legendary beauties of history. Women who'd been given gifts of spindles, coated in plague pus, perfumes, laced with slow-acting poisons, even a particularly inventive case involving a prayer book whose gilded pages had been painted with toxic mercury. Sir Guy arrived as Ale was prodding the comb with a stick. "I see you've joined the ranks of the dangerously attractive," he said, nudging it with his boot. "Congratulations, Canopy. Detimothin, little of a man that goes by. Better race." Ale scowled. "I didn't ask for this." "No one asks for the poisoned comb," Guy said solemnly. "The poisoned comb asks for you." The question, of course, was who had sent it. The obvious suspect was the Lord's son, still smarting from her very public rejection. But there were other candidates. The miller's wife, who'd been making pointed comments about Ales's unnatural look since the beauty tax protest. The bishop's nephew, who'd taken to giving sermons about harlots who tempt good men. Even the blacksmith's daughter, whose sweetheart had written truly terrible poetry about Ales's eyelashes last spring. Anselm proposed a test involving a chicken and the comb, but before they could proceed, the merchant's daughter arrived with better intelligence. "It's from Lady Isolde," she whispered, glancing over her shoulder. "The Duke's cousin." She heard the minstrels comparing her to a fading rose, and you to a fresh bloom at last week's feast. Guy winced. Never trust a minstrel. Their similes will get you killed. Ale stared at the comb. Part of her wanted to toss it in the river. Another part, the part that had spent years being treated as either a prize or a problem, bristled at the sheer arrogance of it. Who did these people think they were? She made her decision. That Sunday, when the village gathered for Mass, Alais arrived with her hair elaborately braided and the poisoned comb prominently displayed. She'd soaked it in vinegar for 3 days to neutralize any toxins, then polished it to a harmless shine. Now it glinted from her coiled tresses like a crown as she walked slowly up the aisle. The gasps were audible. Father Martel's sermon about vanity died in his throat, and when the visiting bishop's nephew reached out to touch it, murmuring about confiscating such a worldly object, Alais fixed him with her sweetest smile and said loudly enough for the whole church to hear, "Oh, but it was a gift from your Aunt Isolde. Surely you wouldn't call her pious generosity sinful." The resulting scandal kept the village gossiping for weeks. Lady Isolde was summoned to explain herself to the Duke. The bishop's nephew was reassigned to a remote monastery. And Alais? She kept the comb, not as adornment but as a reminder. Because the truly dangerous thing about beauty wasn't the jealousy it inspired. It was the way people assumed you couldn't possibly be clever enough to survive it. As she walked home that evening, Guy fell into step beside her. "You know," he said conversationally, "most people would have just thrown it away." Alais touched the comb, its teeth now safely blunted. "And let them win?" Guy grinned. "Point taken. But you might want to check your shoes for scorpions tomorrow." "Already planned to," Alais said, and for once they weren't joking. Because in a world where beauty could be both weapon and wound, the only real defense was to be sharper than the poisoned comb, and twice as unexpected. Chapter 12. The Unfortunate Fate of the Fair. The day the Duke's men came for Marguerite, the entire village pretended not to notice. Alais watched from behind the baker's shed as they dragged the miller's daughter, now pale and silent as milk, toward the waiting carriage. Her crime? Being too beautiful for the local lord's son to forget, yet not noble enough to marry. The solution? A one-way trip to the convent of perpetual chastity, where the ducal family generously paid for her spiritual education. Marguerite's eyes met Alais for one fleeting moment as the carriage door slammed shut. There were no tears, only a terrible understanding. This was how the story ended for girls like them. Brother Anselm found Alais retching behind the blacksmith's shop an hour later. "Ah," he said, handing her a cloth without preamble. "I see you've discovered the final act of our little morality play." Alais wiped her mouth, her hands shaking. "They'll do the same to me, eventually, won't they?" "Not necessarily," Anselm mused. "You could always marry some toothless old widower, or contract a disfiguring pox, or, and this is my personal favorite, fake your own death and join a traveling troupe of actors." The joke fell flat, because the truth was laid bare now. Beauty without power was a prison sentence waiting to be carried out. Alais had heard the stories. The merchant's wife locked in a tower by her jealous husband, the farmer's daughter forced to wed a violent knight twice her age, the countless girls who disappeared into convents when they became inconvenient reminders of noblemen's indiscretions. That evening, Sir Guy found Alais sharpening a kitchen knife with unsettling intensity. "Planning a murder or a meal?" he asked lightly, though his eyes were serious. "Does it matter?" Alais snapped. Then, quieter, "They took Marguerite today." Guy's jaw tightened. "I know." Of course he knew. The ducal family's reputation for tidying up loose ends was legendary. Just last year, a particularly inconveniently beautiful shepherd's daughter had been found dead under mysterious circumstances after rejecting the Duke's advances. The official report claimed she drowned while washing sheep's wool. Never mind that the stream in question was barely ankle-deep. Alais set down the knife with deliberate care. "How do you live with it, knowing what men like your father do?" Guy flinched but didn't deny it. "Badly," he admitted. "With much drinking and poor decisions." He turned his signet ring, the Montferrat crest gleaming in the firelight, but mostly by remembering that titles can be weapons too, if you point them in the right direction. An idea began to take shape in Alaise's mind. A dangerous one. Possibly stupid. But as she watched the last light fade from Marguerite's empty house across the lane, she realized something. The only way to survive being a prize was to make yourself too expensive to claim. The next morning, Alaise dressed carefully. She left her hair unbound, a brazen act for an unmarried girl, and wore the poisoned comb like a badge of honor. At the well, where the village women gathered to whisper about Marguerite's good fortune in being chosen for religious life, Alaise made sure to laugh just a bit too loud, to stand just a bit too close, to let her sleeve brush against the Reeve's arm as she passed. By noon, the rumors were spreading like wildfire. Alaise the pious had fallen from grace. Alaise the fair was tempting men deliberately. Alaise the suddenly very dangerous problem was flaunting herself like a tavern wench. Father Martel came to lecture her. She smiled blankly and asked if he'd like to inspect her teeth next, since he seemed so interested in her mouth. The Reeve attempted to chastise her, until she mentioned how interesting the Duke might find his tax records. And when the Lord's son came sniffing around, thinking her sudden looseness meant easy conquest, Alaise greeted him with a sweetness that made his eyes narrow in suspicion. "My lord," she simpered, loud enough for the whole market to hear, "how kind of you to visit so soon after sending Marguerite away. Tell me, does your father know you're here? Or does he prefer you wait until the carriage to the convent is ready?" The young lord turned the color of week old meat. He left without another word. That night, Guy appeared at her door with a bottle of wine, and an expression torn between admiration and terror. "You do realize you've just painted a target on your back?" Alaise took the wine. "Better a target than a cage. Because here was the truth they never told you about beautiful victims. They only became victims when they played their assigned roles. The demure maiden, the blushing bride, the silent nun. But a woman who made herself inconvenient, who turned her beauty from a lure into a weapon. That was a story with different endings. Some of those endings might still be tragic, but at least they'd be hers." As the first stars appeared, Alaise made a silent promise to Marguerite, wherever she was. This would not be her fate. She would be neither sacrifice nor saint. And if the world insisted on making her a legend, she'd make damn sure it was one they wouldn't forget. Chapter 13. The Rise of the Plain. A Counterculture. The morning after Alaise's very public unraveling, the village awoke to an unexpected sight. Half the young women had suddenly become remarkably plain. Jeanne the weaver's daughter, normally proud of her flaxen braids, appeared at the well with her hair hacked short as a boy's. Lisette, whose rosebud mouth had once inspired terrible poetry from the blacksmith's apprentice, now kept her lips perpetually pursed in what appeared to be a sour expression. Even Marie, the prettiest of the milkmaids, had taken to rubbing her face with ashes before dawn. It was, Alaise realized with dawning amusement, a rebellion in reverse. Brother Anselm observed the phenomenon while pretending to examine a stall of dubious relics. "Ah, the great homely uprising of '38, he murmured to Alaise. Last time this happened, it took 3 troubadours and a royal decree about mandatory cheek-pinching to restore order. The strategy was sound, if depressing. In a world where beauty brought danger, ugliness might bring safety." Alaise had considered it herself after Marguerite's disappearance, smearing her face with lye soap until her skin cracked, or perhaps accidentally catching her hair in the cooking fire. But something about this mass self-marring sat wrong with her. It wasn't a choice. It was surrender. The irony, of course, was that the plainness ploy didn't always work. That evening, Alaise watched as Lisette's carefully cultivated scowl backfired spectacularly when the bishop's nephew declared her piquant and full of spirit. The more she scowled, the more intrigued he became. until poor Lisette looked ready to chew off her own lips in frustration. Meanwhile, Jean's cropped hair had the opposite of its intended effect. The village boys, initially taken aback, soon decided there was something thrillingly daring about a girl who looked like she might stab you. Jean spent the entire afternoon fending off marriage proposals from youths who'd never glanced her way before. Only Marie's ash treatment seemed to be working, until the village reeve announced that her new dirtiness was clearly a sign of moral decay, and demanded she be fined for poor hygiene. Sir Guy found Allais watching this circus from the church steps, her expression caught between laughter and despair. "I take it back," he said, handing her a stolen pastry. "Your approach was smarter. At least when you were being outrageous, it was on your terms." Allais picked at the pastry, her fingers leaving smudges in the flaky crust. "They shouldn't have to do this. None of us should." Guy studied the scene before them. Jean brandishing her shears at an admirer, Lisette attempting to hide behind a startled goat, Marie scrubbing her face raw at the well while the reeve leered. "No," he agreed quietly. "But until the rules change, people will keep finding ways to survive them." Allais thought of the mirror shard hidden under her floorboards, of the rouge pot buried in the garden. She thought of Marguerite, whisked away to a life of enforced chastity, and of the Duke's son still lurking at the edges of the village like a spoiled wolf. Then she stood, brushing crumbs from her skirt. "Maybe it's not about changing the rules," she said. "Maybe it's about changing the game." Because here was the truth they were all learning the hard way. Whether you played the beauty or the beast, someone else still held the leash. The only way out was to stop playing altogether, or better yet, to deal the cards yourself. As dusk settled over the village, Allais made her way to Marguerite's empty house. From her pocket, she drew the poisoned comb and placed it carefully on the abandoned hearth. Not as a tribute, not as a surrender, but as a promise. They would not disappear her. They would not tame her. And if they came for her, by God, they would remember it. The next morning, the village awoke to find Allais back to her old self. Hair neatly braided, face clean, every inch the picture of modest womanhood. Only those who looked closely would notice the glint of something harder in her eyes, the set of her shoulders that suggested she'd made decisions in the night. Brother Anselm, observing her at Mass, leaned over to whisper, "I do hope you've chosen something survivable." "I'm too old to visit you in a nunnery." Allais smiled sweetly and said nothing at all. Because the most dangerous thing in the world wasn't a beautiful woman or a plain one. It was a woman who refused to be either. Chapter 14. Beauty in Art and Literature. A Double-Edged Sword. The traveling minstrel's song about the raven-haired temptress would have been flattering if it hadn't been clearly about Allais. She stood at the edge of the market square, arms crossed, as the man warbled about lips like rubies and a gaze that could damn a saint. The villagers tittered, shooting glances between the singer and the subject of his ode. Even the goats seemed to be judging her. Brother Anselm, chewing on a honey cake nearby, leaned in with theatrical sympathy. "Look on the bright side. Last month in Avignon, a poet compared his muse to a goat's bladder. This is practically a compliment." The problem, Allais was discovering, was that once people decided you were beautiful, they never let you be anything else. Artists painted you as either a saint or a seductress. Poets penned verses about your eyelashes while ignoring your actual thoughts. And somewhere along the way you became less a person and more a symbol of virtue, of sin, of whatever fantasy the beholder needed you to be. Sir Guy arrived as the minstrel was reaching particularly purple heights about Allais's alabaster throat. He listened for precisely 3 lines before tossing a coin at the man's feet. For the love of God, learn some new adjectives. The contradiction in how beauty was depicted fascinated Allais. In the church frescoes, the Virgin Mary glowed with impossible serenity, her features smooth as a river stone, her hands forever folded in prayer. Meanwhile, the carving of Eve by the baptismal font was all exaggerated curves and knowing smiles, her wooden body twisting around the tree like a warning. "There's no winning," Allais muttered, tracing Eve's chipped nose with one finger. "Be demure, and you're a statue. Be bold, and you're a cautionary tale." Guy studied the carving with a critical eye. I think the artist just really liked breasts. But the issue ran deeper than bad art. That afternoon, while delivering eggs to the manor, Allais glimpsed the Lord's new illuminated manuscript, a psalter open to an illustration of Judith beheading Holofernes. The biblical heroine was rendered with dainty features and rosebud lips, her delicate hands wielding the sword as daintily as a sewing needle. The reality, a widow saving her people through brutal cunning, had been sanded down into something palatable, pretty. The merchant's daughter, catching Allais's expression, whispered, "Wait until you see how they paint Bathsheba." Apparently getting harassed by a king becomes seduction if you're pretty enough. This cultural alchemy, turning flesh and blood women into symbols, lessons, ornaments, was perhaps the most insidious trap of all. Because once people decided what you represented, they stopped seeing you entirely. Allais tested this theory that evening at the tavern. When a traveling scribe asked her to pose for a sketch, for pious purposes only, of course, she agreed, but insisted on holding a butcher's cleaver instead of the expected flowers. The resulting drawing was hilariously bad, the artist so thrown by her request that Judith's sword had somehow migrated into her portrait. Brother Anselm declared it a masterpiece. "Look how he's captured your spiritual murderousness." The lesson stuck. The next time a troubadour tried to serenade her, Allais countered with an impromptu ballad of her own, a decidedly unflattering ode to the singer's receding hairline and questionable hygiene. The crowd roared with laughter while the minstrel turned splotchy red. "You'll regret that," he hissed as he packed his lute. "No one mocks the craft." Allais smiled sweetly. Then maybe the craft should stop reducing women to scenery. As word spread of the incident, an odd thing happened. Other village girls began following her lead. Marie quoted scripture at men who tried to compliment her. Lisette took up the lute herself, penning blistering satires about vain knights. Even meek Jeanne started correcting poets who mispronounced her name in their verses. It wasn't revolution, but it was a start. That night, Allais lay awake, studying her stolen mirror shard by candlelight. The face looking back at her was the same as always. Same freckles, same stubborn chin, same eyes that could be called damning or devout depending on who was looking. The difference was this: she was learning to control the narrative. Let them paint her as saint or seductress. She'd be the brush. Because beauty in art might be a double-edged sword, but Allais was getting very good at wielding sharp objects. Chapter 15. The Legacy of Medieval Beauty Standards. Years later, when the fever took Brother Anselm, he left Allais two things: his collection of honey-stained manuscripts and a cryptic warning whispered with his last breath. "They'll never stop trying to define you, girl. The trick is to make sure they use your dictionary." As Allais stood by his grave, the first snow of winter dusting the turned earth like powdered sugar, she realized how right he'd been. The world had not changed as much as she'd hoped. The new young lord still eyed village girls like they were menu items. The bishop's sermons still conflated beauty with morality, and the traveling artists still painted women as either angels or temptresses, with no allowance for anything in between. Yet something had shifted. The village women no longer flinched when poets sang of their virtue. The miller's new daughter, a bold girl with a laugh like a crow, openly mocked suitors who came bearing generic sonnets. And in the church, where the old carving of Eve still twisted around her tree, someone had pinned up a crude but heartfelt sketch of Judith, cleaver in hand, winking. Sir Guy, now sporting streaks of silver in his still unmanageable hair, found Allais studying her reflection in the frozen millpond one morning. "Planning another revolution?" he asked, tossing a pebble to shatter her image. Allais watched the eyes knit itself back together. "Just thinking how little the game has changed. We still praise beauty when it's convenient and punish it when it's not. We still call powerful women intimidating and plain ones sweet. The costumes are different, but the play's the same. Guy nodded toward the village, where a group of girls were playing some new game involving sticks, and what appeared to be very dramatic death scenes. But the players are learning. He had a point. The current generation of village girls had never known a time when Ale wasn't there to roll her eyes at bad poetry or demonstrate how to turn a compliment into a weapon. They'd grown up hearing the story of Marguerite, not as a cautionary tale, but as inspiration to fight back. And they'd perfected the art of loud, inconvenient questions whenever someone tried to tell them how to look or behave. That evening, as Ale tucked her own daughter into bed, a sharp-eyed child who'd inherited her father's talent for sarcasm and her mother's refusal to sit still for portraits, she realized Anselm's legacy wasn't just in his books. It was in this, the understanding that beauty standards weren't laws of nature, but stories people told to maintain order. And stories, as any good troublemaker knew, could always be rewritten. As the candle guttered, Ale pressed a kiss to her daughter's forehead, then blew out the flame. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the village in a clean, blank slate. Tomorrow they would begin again. Because the true legacy of medieval beauty standards wasn't in the rules themselves, but in the quiet rebellions they inspired, the countless small acts of defiance that, like water on stone, eventually wore them down. And if the world still struggled to see women as more than pretty objects or moral lessons, well, that just meant the work wasn't finished. Ale smiled in the dark. She'd always preferred projects to pedestals anyway. The end.